Montana Territory, 1872. The Montana sky stretched endlessly above the rolling hills, a canvas of deepening purples and fiery oranges as the sun slipped behind the distant mountains. Lillian Grayson stood on the porch of her small homestead, 22 years of life's disappointments carved into the tight lines around her eyes that seemed out of place on such a youthful face. Her chestnut hair, pulled back in a practical braid that hung to her mid-back, caught the last golden rays of daylight as she surveyed the land that had become both her prison and her salvation. 3 years had passed since she'd buried her father beneath the old cottonwood tree that stood sentinel at the edge of their modest property. 3 years of working the land alone, of fending off both nature's cruelty and men's advances. 3 years of convincing herself that solitude was preferable to the pain that came with attachment. "You can depend on the land and yourself, Lily," her father had told her before consumption claimed him. "Everything else will break your heart." She'd taken those words and woven them into armor, believing them because believing was easier than hoping. Believing kept her safe in a territory where safety was as rare as rain in August. Lillian tugged her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders as the evening chill settled over the valley. The small ranch house behind her had once been filled with laughter, her mother's melodic voice, her father's booming chuckles, even her own girlish giggles. Now it echoed with emptiness, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of the weathered floorboards or the persistent Montana wind that seemed to whisper reminders of all she'd lost. She turned to head inside when movement caught her eye, a distant figure on horseback, silhouetted against the darkening horizon, swaying precariously in the saddle. Lillian narrowed her eyes, one hand instinctively moving to the rifle that leaned against the porch railing. Visitors were rare at her isolated homestead, and uninvited ones were rarely bearers of good news. As the rider drew closer, Lillian could see it was a man, slumped forward over his horse's neck. The animal moved with purpose despite lacking guidance, as if it knew its rider needed help and had chosen her homestead as sanctuary. When the horse came within 50 yards, she could see dark stains on the rider's shirt, blood, fresh and plentiful. "Whoa there," she called as the horse approached, its eyes wide with exhaustion. The animal stopped at the sound of her voice, and the man slid sideways, tumbling from the saddle to land with a dull thud on the hard-packed earth. Lillian hesitated, her father's warnings echoing in her mind. Strangers meant trouble, caring meant vulnerability. But as the man groaned weakly, something deeper than her practiced caution stirred within her, something she thought she'd buried alongside her parents. Compassion. With a sigh that held both resignation and determination, Lillian propped her rifle against the porch and approached. "Well," she murmured to herself, "I suppose I cannot let a man die on my doorstep, even if inviting trouble seems to be exactly what I'm doing." She knelt beside him, gently turning him onto his back. He was young, perhaps 25, with features that would have been handsome had they not been contorted in pain and smeared with trail dust and blood. A bullet wound in his left shoulder oozed dark blood, and his breathing came in shallow, ragged gasps. "Can you hear me?" she asked, pressing her fingers to his neck to find his pulse racing beneath her touch. His eyes fluttered open, clear blue like the Montana sky after a spring rain, and fixed on her face with surprising clarity despite his condition. "Angel," he whispered. "Hardly," she replied dryly. "My name is Lillian Grayson. You've been shot and you're bleeding all over my yard." A ghost of a smile touched his lips before his eyes rolled back and consciousness fled. Lillian sat back on her heels, looking from the unconscious stranger to her empty house and back again. She knew what the wise choice would be, what her father would have advised: leave him, send his horse to find help elsewhere, protect herself from whatever storm had brought a bullet-riddled cowboy to her door. But as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Lillian made a different choice, one that would challenge everything she'd come to believe about life on the frontier. "Come on, then," she grunted, hooking her arms beneath his and beginning the arduous task of dragging him toward the house. "But don't think for one moment this means I'm letting my guard down." The wounded man didn't respond, of course, but as Lillian struggled with his weight, she couldn't help feeling that some invisible line had been crossed, one that separated her carefully constructed isolation from something unknown and potentially dangerous. Not just to her homestead, but to her heart. Matthew Jameson knew 3 things when consciousness returned to him in broken fragments. First, he was alive, which, considering the circumstances of his last clear memory, seemed something of a miracle. Second, he was in considerable pain, though dulled enough to suggest someone had tended to his wounds. And third, the ceiling above him was unfamiliar, rough-hewn logs joined with obvious care but not professional craftsmanship. He attempted to sit up, a decision his body immediately protested with a wave of dizziness and sharp pain lancing through his left shoulder. A small sound escaped him, half groan, half curse, and almost instantly footsteps approached. "So you've decided to rejoin the living." The voice was female, controlled but with an undercurrent of wariness. Matthew turned his head toward it and found himself looking at a young woman with the most guarded expression he'd ever encountered. She stood in the doorway, a steaming cup in one hand and a wary distance between them that suggested she trusted him about as much as she might trust a coiled rattlesnake. "Seems that way," he managed, his voice rough from disuse. "Though I'm not entirely convinced it was the right choice." Something that might have been amusement flickered briefly across her features before being replaced by the careful neutrality she seemed to prefer. She was beautiful, he realized with a clarity that surprised him given his condition, not in the painted, deliberate way of saloon girls, but in a natural, unadorned manner that spoke of strength and self-reliance. Her chestnut hair was pulled back severely, and her simple calico dress was practical rather than flattering, yet neither diminished the impact of her presence. "You've been unconscious for 2 days," she said, approaching cautiously to place the cup on the small table beside the bed. "The fever broke last night. I managed to get the bullet out, but you lost a fair amount of blood." Matthew tried to absorb this information, searching his memory for how he'd come to be shot in the first place. Fragments returned, riding hard, the unexpected crack of a rifle, the burning sensation as lead tore through his shoulder, his horse carrying him away from danger toward, where, he couldn't remember choosing a direction. "Thank you, Miss Grayson, Lillian Grayson," she supplied, staying just beyond his reach. "And you are?" "Matthew Jameson," he replied, wincing as he shifted position. "Most folks call me Matt." "Well, Mr. Jameson, perhaps you'd like to explain why you arrived at my homestead with a bullet in your shoulder and what sort of trouble might be following you." There was no warmth in her question, just practical concern for her own safety. Matthew couldn't blame her. A woman alone on the frontier had every reason to be cautious. "I'm not certain about that myself," he admitted. "I was riding back from Bitter Creek after delivering a herd for the Double Diamond Ranch. I worked there as a drover." He paused, gathering fragmented memories. "I took a shortcut through Curtis Pass. Someone shot at me from the ridge above." "Didn't see who?" Lillian's expression remained skeptical. "Most men know who's trying to kill them, Mr. Jameson." "Most men, perhaps, but I'm not carrying gold. I haven't stolen another man's wife, and as far as I know, I haven't crossed anybody who'd want me dead." He met her gaze steadily. "I'm a simple cowhand, Miss Grayson. The most excitement I've had was breaking a particularly ornery Mustang last spring." She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to read the truth in his face. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her somewhat, because she sighed and indicated the cup on the table. "It's willow bark tea, bitter as sin, but it'll help with the pain and fever." Matthew reached for it with his good arm, trying to hide his grimace as the movement pulled at his injured shoulder. "I appreciate your help. Not many would take in a stranger bleeding all over their doorstep." "I considered dragging you to the barn," she replied matter-of-factly, "but you might have died, and I didn't want to explain a corpse to the next passing lawman." Her bluntness startled a laugh from him, which quickly transformed into a pained cough. "Practical considerations, I can respect that." Something almost like a smile touched her lips before she turned away. "Your horse is in the corral. He's been fed and watered. Your saddle and belongings are in the corner there, though I took the liberty of cleaning your revolver. It was in a disgraceful state." Matthew glanced toward the corner where, indeed, his worn saddle and saddlebags rested. Atop them sat his Colt, looking more polished than it had in months. "You know your way around firearms," he observed. "A woman alone needs to," she replied simply. "Rest now. There's stew when you're ready for it, but don't rush. I've no desire to change your bandages again because you've torn open that wound being stubborn." With that, she departed, leaving Matthew to sip the bitter tea and contemplate his mysterious benefactor. He'd encountered all manner of people in his years drifting across the Western territories, hard men, desperate women, grifters and saints alike, but Lillian Grayson was something altogether different. She'd saved his life while making it abundantly clear she expected nothing in return, not even gratitude. There was a story there, he was certain. People didn't develop such careful defenses without reason. But as the willow bark began to dull his pain and drowsiness crept over him again, Matthew decided that mystery could wait for another day. For now, he was alive, sheltered, and in the care of the most interesting woman he'd encountered in a very long time, despite her obvious desire to keep him at arm's length. Over the following days, Lillian settled into an uneasy routine with her unexpected houseguest. She tended his wound, brought him meals, and answered his occasional questions with as few words as possible. Yet despite her efforts to maintain distance, Matthew Jameson proved irritatingly difficult to dislike. He never complained about the pain she knew he must be feeling. He expressed genuine gratitude for even the smallest considerations. Worst of all, he seemed to understand her need for space without taking offense, accepting her brusque manner with a patience that made her feel unreasonably churlish. On the 5th day, she entered the small bedroom to find him sitting up, his back against the headboard and perspiration beading his forehead from the effort. "You shouldn't be exerting yourself," she scolded, setting down the breakfast tray with more force than necessary. "I'm not one for lying around when there's work to be done," he replied, offering that easy smile that somehow made the room feel smaller. "I imagine you've got chores piling up with me taking up space and time." Lillian busied herself straightening items on the tray, avoiding his gaze. "I manage." "I'm sure you do, but I'd like to help as soon as I'm able." He gestured toward the window where her small vegetable garden and chicken coop were visible. "That fence around your coop needs mending. I noticed a fox skulking around yesterday evening." Surprised, Lillian looked up. "You've been watching through the window." "Not much else to do," he admitted. "I counted 17 chickens. You're missing one from when I arrived." The observation caught her off guard. She had indeed lost a hen 2 nights ago, but hadn't mentioned it. "You've been keeping count of my chickens." A hint of color touched his cheeks, force of habit. "On the ranch, we account for every head of livestock daily." "I'm not running a cattle operation, Mr. Jameson." "Matt," he corrected gently, "and 18 chickens is 18 chickens. Each one matters when you're living off what you can produce." There was no condescension in his tone, only understanding that spoke of similar experiences. For the first time, Lillian truly looked at him, not as an inconvenience or potential threat, but as a person. The morning light filtering through the window illuminated features that hardship had matured without hardening. His blue eyes held a directness that suggested honesty rather than calculation, and the set of his jaw spoke of determination tempered by kindness. "The fox took Henrietta," she found herself saying. "She was my best layer." Matthew's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "I'm sorry to hear that. When I'm back on my feet, I'll reinforce that coop better than Fort Laramie. No fox will get through it." "You'll be gone by then," Lillian reminded him, as much for herself as for him. "Perhaps, but I pay my debts, Miss Grayson. You saved my life." "Lillian," she said, surprising herself, "if I'm to call you Matt, you might as well use my name." The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, warm and full of promise. "Lillian," he repeated as if testing the feel of it, "it suits you." She felt heat rise to her cheeks and turned away, irritated by her own reaction. What was it about this man that made her defenses feel so fragile? She turned away ranch hands, travelers, and even a persistent shopkeeper's son without a second thought. Yet 5 days with Matthew Jameson, and she was blushing like a schoolgirl at the simple sound of her name on his lips. "Your breakfast is getting cold," she said briskly, moving toward the door. "Eat, then rest, doctor's orders." "Are you a doctor now?" he called after her, amusement clear in his voice. "I'm the closest thing to one you've got," she replied over her shoulder, "and I didn't drag your bleeding self into my house just to have you undo my hard work by being stubborn." His laughter followed her into the hallway, a rich, genuine sound that seemed to echo in the small house long after she'd escaped to the sanctuary of her kitchen. Lillian pressed her hands against the worn wooden countertop, trying to steady herself against the unwelcome warmth spreading through her chest. This is temporary, she reminded herself firmly. He'll heal, he'll leave, and things will return to normal. But as she mechanically went about her morning chores, a treacherous part of her whispered that perhaps normal had never felt quite so empty before. By the end of the second week, Matthew had progressed to sitting in a chair by the hearth, regaining his strength while Lillian worked around him. Though she still maintained her reserve, the sharp edges of her wariness had softened somewhat. She no longer watched him as if expecting him to reveal villainous intentions at any moment, and occasionally he even coaxed the ghost of a smile from her. "Tell me about your ranch," she said one evening as she mended a tear in one of her father's old shirts she'd given him to wear. "The double diamond, was it?" Matthew nodded, watching the firelight play across her features as she worked. "It's not my ranch, but yes, the double diamond. 15,000 acres west of here, running about 2,000 head of cattle. I've been working there since I was 19. "And before that?" she asked, her eyes remaining on her needlework. "Before that, I was wherever work could be found," he admitted. "My father died when I was 16, influenza. My mother had passed years earlier, so I set out on my own." Lillian's hands stilled briefly. "You've been alone since you were 16. "Not alone exactly. There's always work for willing hands in the territories. I fell in with good people more often than not," he smiled at a memory. "Spent a season with a trail outfit running cattle up from Texas. The cook, old Henry, took a shine to me. Taught me how to make a biscuit that wouldn't break a man's teeth and how to read the weather and the way cattle behave." "You can predict weather by watching cows?" Lillian asked, skepticism clear in her voice. Matthew chuckled. "More accurately than you might think. When they all start pointing in the same direction and lie down, storm's coming for certain." A comfortable silence fell between them as Lillian continued her mending, and Matthew watched the dance of flames in the hearth. Outside, the spring wind whistled around the corners of the house, carrying the promise of rain. "What about you?" he asked finally. "Have you always lived here?" The needle paused again, longer this time. "No," she said after a moment. "We came here when I was 16. Before that, we were in Colorado. My father had a claim there, but it played out." "Just the two of you?" Lillian nodded, her expression closing slightly. "My mother died when I was 12, childbirth. The baby, my brother, didn't survive either." "I'm sorry," Matthew said softly, understanding now some part of what had shaped her solitary existence. "That's a heavy burden for a young girl." "We manage with what life gives us," she replied, her tone carefully neutral. "My father built this place, worked himself to exhaustion making it viable. I promised him I'd keep it going." "And you have," Matthew observed, genuine admiration in his voice. "Not many could do what you've done, man or woman." Lillian finally looked up, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "Is that what you see?" "Success," she gestured around the modest cabin. "This place is barely hanging on. The roof leaks when the rain comes heavy. The north field needs clearing if I'm to plant more than just enough to feed myself. The well runs low in August." She shook her head. "Some days I wonder if I'm honoring my father's memory or just being stubborn." It was the most she'd revealed of herself since he'd arrived, and Matthew recognized the admission for the rare trust it represented. "There's honor in both," he said carefully, "but I think you're selling yourself short. This land has life because of you, that matters." For a moment, something vulnerable flickered in her expression, something that made him want to cross the room and take her hand. But before he could move, she blinked and the moment passed. "Well, it's the only home I've got," she said practically, returning to her sewing, "so it will have to do." Matthew watched her, noting the deft way her fingers manipulated the needle, the slight furrow of concentration between her brows, the strand of chestnut hair that had escaped her braid to curl against her cheek. He was suddenly struck by how young she truly was, perhaps only 22 or 23, yet bearing responsibilities that would have crushed many twice her age. "You know," he said cautiously, "when I'm fully recovered, I could stay on a while, help with some of those repairs before I head back to the Double Diamond." Her hand stilled completely this time. "Why would you do that?" The question held genuine puzzlement rather than suspicion, which Matthew found more telling than any of their previous conversations. She truly couldn't fathom why someone would offer help without expectation. "Because you helped me when I needed it," he answered simply, "and because it's the right thing to do." Lillian studied him, searching his face as if looking for some hidden motive. "People don't usually do things just because they're right, Mr. Jameson, not in my experience." "Then perhaps your experience has been limited," he suggested gently. "There's still good in this world, Lillian. Even out here on the frontier." She set her sewing aside, suddenly looking tired. "The frontier doesn't reward good, Matt. It rewards strength and caution. My father was a good man, the best I've ever known. This land took him anyway." The bitterness in her voice revealed the wound that still festered beneath her carefully maintained composure. Matthew recognized it because he'd carried similar wounds, the kind that healed over but never truly closed, changing the way you moved through the world. "I won't argue with that," he conceded. "The frontier is unforgiving, but that doesn't mean we have to be." Lillian rose, gathering her sewing. "It's getting late. You should rest if you want that shoulder to heal properly." Matthew recognized the retreat for what it was. He'd pushed too far, too fast. "Thank you for the company," he said instead of pressing, "and for the shirt." She paused at the doorway, not quite looking back at him. "You're welcome to stay until you're fully healed, Matt. After that," she hesitated. "We'll see." It wasn't acceptance of his offer to help, but it wasn't outright rejection either. As she disappeared down the hallway, Matthew settled back in his chair, watching the fire burn down to embers. Progress, he decided, small but significant, like coaxing a wild horse to take the first oat from your palm. The trust wasn't built yet, but at least she was considering the possibility. Outside, the spring rain began to fall, drumming gently on the roof that needed repair. Matthew made a mental note to check for leaks in the morning and began planning how he might fix them without overstepping the fragile boundaries Lillian had established. One step at a time, he thought, just like breaking a wild horse. The early Montana spring gave way to a vibrant May, and with it, Matthew's strength returned in earnest. What had begun as short walks around the cabin extended to accompanying Lillian on her daily chores, first as an observer and then, despite her protests, as an active participant. "You're favoring that shoulder," Lillian noted as she watched him split firewood one afternoon. "You'll reopen the wound." Matthew paused, wiping sweat from his brow with his shirt sleeve. "It's healing fine. Besides, these muscles won't strengthen if I coddle them." She crossed her arms, the familiar stubborn set to her jaw that he'd come to find endearing. "And if you tear something and start bleeding again, what then?" "The nearest doctor is in Bitter Creek, 2 days' ride." "Then I suppose you'll have to patch me up again," he replied with a grin, "though I promise to be a more conscious patient this time." Lillian rolled her eyes, but the corners of her mouth twitched upward. "One would think nearly dying might have taught you some caution." "One would be wrong," Matthew conceded cheerfully, setting another log on the chopping block. "But I've always been a slow learner when it comes to self-preservation." The truth was, his shoulder ached fiercely, but the satisfaction of contributing to the homestead's upkeep outweighed the discomfort. Over the past 3 weeks, he'd repaired the chicken coop as promised, patched the worst of the roof leaks, and mended the broken wheel on Lillian's cart. Small contributions, but each one had been met with grudging appreciation that felt more rewarding than any payment he'd received for his work as a cowhand. More significant than the physical repairs, however, was the gradual thawing of Lillian's reserve. She still maintained careful boundaries, but their conversations had grown longer, deeper, occasionally stretching late into the evening by the hearth fire. He'd learned about her childhood in Colorado, her father's dreams for their Montana homestead, and her own quiet ambitions to expand the vegetable garden into something that might provide extra income at the Bitter Creek market. In turn, he'd shared stories of cattle drives and ranch life, the characters he'd met on the trail, and his own modest hope to someday have a place to call his own. Not a grand ranch like the Double Diamond, but something sustainable, something built with his own hands that could weather the seasons of life. As April had turned to May, Matthew had found himself less eager to return to the Double Diamond than he'd expected. The ranch would hold his position, good cowhands were valuable, and he'd proven his worth over the years, but for the first time since his father's death, he'd found a place that felt like it might become something more than temporary shelter. The thought was as unsettling as it was compelling. "That's enough wood," Lillian called, interrupting his reverie. Supper's nearly ready and you need to wash up." Matthew embedded the axe in the chopping block and gathered an armful of split logs. "Yes, ma'am," he replied with exaggerated deference that earned him another eye roll. Inside the cabin, the savory aroma of rabbit stew filled the air. Matthew stacked the firewood neatly beside the hearth, then moved to the wash basin where Lillian had set out a cloth and soap. As he scrubbed away the dirt and sweat of the day's work, he watched her move efficiently around the small kitchen, her movements graceful despite their practicality. "I rode out to the north field this morning," he mentioned casually as he dried his hands. "You were right about it needing clearing, but the soil beneath looks rich. Good for wheat, I'd wager." Lillian glanced up from the pot she was stirring. "You rode copper, I didn't give you permission to take my horse." "I took my own," Matthew corrected. "He's been getting restless in the corral, needed the exercise as much as I did." She frowned. "Your shoulder isn't ready for riding." "Seems it disagreed with you," he replied mildly, "but that's not the point. That north field could double your harvest if cleared and planted properly." Lillian sighed, ladling stew into 2 bowls. "I'm well aware of what that field could be, Matt. I'm also aware that clearing it would take weeks of backbreaking work that I cannot manage alone." "You're not alone now," he pointed out, taking the bowls from her and placing them on the table. She looked at him directly, then her expression suddenly serious. "For how long? You've nearly healed. The double diamond will be expecting you back." The question hung between them, loaded with unspoken implications. Matthew considered his words carefully. "The spring drive doesn't start for another 3 weeks, he said finally. "If I sent word to the foreman explaining my absence, I could stay until then. Help you get that field cleared and planted before I go." "And then," Lillian pressed, her voice carefully neutral, "what happens to half-grown wheat when you're gone?" Matthew held her gaze. "I'd come back after the drive. If you'd allow it." Something flickered in her eyes, hope perhaps, or fear, maybe both. "That's nearly 2 months from now. The double diamond might not hold your position that long." "Let me worry about the double diamond," he said quietly. "The question is whether you want me to come back, Lillian." She looked away, busying herself with cutting bread. "This is your recovery talking. Once you're back with other people, with your regular life." She shook her head. "This is just an isolated homestead with a woman who's forgotten how to be properly sociable." Matthew stepped closer, careful not to crowd her. "Is that what you think this is? Some kind of cabin fever making me see things that aren't there?" "I think," she said carefully, still not meeting his eyes, "that gratitude and proximity can create feelings that don't survive distance and time." "Look at me," Matthew requested softly. When she finally raised her eyes to his, he continued, "I was grateful the moment I woke up alive in your home. That was weeks ago. What I feel now has nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with you, Lillian Grayson." Color rose in her cheeks, but she didn't look away. "And what exactly is it you feel, Matthew Jameson?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. He'd expected evasion, not this forthright challenge that demanded equal honesty from him. For a moment, he considered offering some sanitized version of his feelings, something that wouldn't risk the fragile trust they'd built, but Lillian deserved better than half-truths. "I feel like I've found something I didn't know I was searching for," he admitted. "Someone who makes me want to build rather than wander, someone who sees the world clearly, without illusions, yet still finds the strength to face each day with determination." He paused, gathering courage. "Someone I think about when I first wake up and last before I sleep." Lillian's breath caught audibly, her eyes widening at his declaration. For several heartbeats, she simply stared at him, conflict playing across her features. "That's not fair," she finally whispered. "I've worked so hard to be sufficient unto myself." "I know," Matthew acknowledged. "And you've succeeded admirably. You don't need me, Lillian. That's not what I'm suggesting." "Then what are you suggesting?" she asked, vulnerability evident beneath the challenge in her voice. "That perhaps wanting something is different from needing it," he replied gently. "That 2 people can be strong alone but choose to be stronger together." Lillian stepped back, creating distance between them. "The stew is getting cold," she said, her voice steadier than her hands. "We should eat." Matthew recognized the retreat and didn't push further. He nodded, moving to his place at the table. "Of course." They ate in silence for several minutes, the weight of unspoken words filling the space between them. Finally, Lillian set down her spoon. "I could use help clearing that north field," she admitted quietly. "If you're offering." It wasn't an answer to his deeper question, but Matthew recognized it as the concession it was, a small opening in the wall she'd built around herself. "I'm offering," he confirmed, relief washing through him. "We can start tomorrow if you like." She nodded, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "Tomorrow, then." Outside, the evening birds began their chorus as the sun slipped toward the horizon. Inside the small cabin, two people who had grown accustomed to facing the world alone contemplated the possibility of a different path, one neither had anticipated, but both were beginning to want more than they dared admit. The following weeks established a new rhythm to life on the homestead. Each morning, Matthew and Lillian rode out to the north field, where they worked side by side clearing underbrush, removing stones, and preparing the soil for planting. The work was indeed backbreaking, but done together, it progressed steadily. During these days of shared labor, the walls Lillian had built around herself began to crumble stone by stone. Not in dramatic collapse, but in small, significant moments. Her laughter when Matthew told stories of ranch mishaps, her hand occasionally brushing his when passing tools, the way she sometimes watched him when she thought he wouldn't notice. For his part, Matthew found himself increasingly certain that his future lay not with the double diamond but here, on this modest homestead with this remarkable woman. The question was whether Lillian would allow herself to believe in that possibility. "We should be able to finish clearing the western section tomorrow," Matthew observed one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "Then we can start turning the soil." Lillian nodded, her fingers working deftly as she shelled peas into a bowl balanced on her lap. "That still leaves the planting, and you're due to return to the double diamond in 5 days." The reminder hung in the air between them, unresolved despite the approaching deadline. "I've been thinking about that," Matthew began carefully. "I sent that letter to the foreman explaining my situation. I could request an extension." "No," Lillian interrupted, surprising him. "You made a commitment. You should honor it." Matthew studied her profile, trying to discern her thoughts. "And what about my commitment to helping you with this field?" "You've already done more than I could have managed alone," she replied, her eyes remaining on her task. "The rest I can handle." "Lillian," he said quietly, "are you trying to send me away?" Her hands stilled, though she didn't look up. "I'm being practical. The cattle drive will take you away for weeks, perhaps months. This homestead can't survive on possibilities and maybes." "I told you I would come back," Matthew reminded her, the hurt evident in his voice despite his attempt to hide it. "And perhaps you believe that now," she conceded, finally meeting his gaze. "But I've seen what the open country does to men like you, Matt. It calls to something in your blood. Once you're back on the trail with the herd, with your friends and that life," she shook her head. "This place will seem very small by comparison." Matthew set aside the knife he'd been using to whittle a replacement handle for one of her garden tools. "Do you truly believe I'm so fickle? That what I feel for you, for this place, would disappear at the first opportunity?" "I believe," she said carefully, "that the best intentions can be swept away by circumstance. My father intended to see me settled and secure before he died. Circumstances dictated otherwise." The pain behind her words struck Matthew deeply. This wasn't just about him leaving, it was about everyone who had ever left her, by choice or by fate. "What if I didn't go at all?" he asked suddenly. "What if I sent word that I wouldn't be returning to the double diamond?" Alarm flashed across Lillian's face. "You can't do that." "Why not?" "Other men leave the trail. Find places to settle." "Because I won't have you resenting me when winter comes and you're trapped here with nothing but memories of the freedom you gave up," she replied, her voice rising slightly. "I won't be the reason you abandon a life you've built." "Has it occurred to you," Matthew asked gently, "that perhaps I want to build a new life, that perhaps I've been drifting, waiting to find something worth stopping for?" Lillian looked away, blinking rapidly. "You're asking me to believe in something I've never seen last, Matt. Every person I've ever cared for has left me in one way or another." The raw honesty of her admission hung in the air between them. Matthew realized then that no words would convince her, only actions, proven over time, could possibly heal such deep-rooted doubt, and time was precisely what they didn't yet have. "Then here's what I propose," he said after a moment's thought. "I'll go back to the Double Diamond as planned. I'll complete the cattle drive because I gave my word I would, but when it's finished, I'll return, not just for a visit but to stay if you'll have me." Lillian looked at him skeptically. "Just like that, you'd give up your position at the ranch?" "For a chance at something more meaningful, yes." His voice held absolute certainty. "I'll prove to you that some promises can be kept, Lillian. That some people do come back." She studied him, searching his face for any hint of hesitation or insincerity. Finding none, she sighed, her shoulders dropping slightly. "You are the most stubborn man I've ever encountered, Matthew Jameson." A smile tugged at his lips. "I believe that's what they call the pot calling the kettle black, Miss Grayson." The tension broke as a reluctant smile crept across her face. "Perhaps," she conceded. "Very well then, go on your cattle drive, do what you must, and if you still feel the same when it's over, we can discuss what comes next." It wasn't the wholehearted acceptance he might have wished for, but it was honest, and with Lillian, honesty was far more valuable than false assurances. He reached across the space between their chairs and offered his hand, palm up. After a moment's hesitation, she placed her hand in his. Her fingers were roughened but still feminine. The simple touch sent warmth spreading through his chest, more potent than any whiskey. "It's a deal," he said softly, giving her hand a gentle squeeze before releasing it. "And Lillian, I will come back." She nodded, her expression a complex mixture of hope and protective skepticism. "We'll see." As the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared above the mountains, they sat in companionable silence. Nothing was certain, the future remained unwritten, but for now, in this moment, there was peace in the possibility that sometimes, against all odds, people found their way back to where they belonged. The morning of Matthew's departure dawned clear and bright, the June sun already warming the earth as he finished saddling his horse. He'd spent the previous day helping Lillian plant the newly cleared field, working until dusk to ensure as much was completed as possible before he left. Now, with his saddlebags packed and his debt to the Double Diamond calling, he found himself lingering, reluctant to leave despite his promises to return. Something about riding away from this place, from her, felt dangerously final, as if the moment he crossed the property boundary, the connection they'd forged might unravel like morning mist in sunshine. "You're ready then," Lillian observed, emerging from the house with a small package wrapped in oilcloth. She'd been quieter than usual that morning, her movements efficient but distracted. "As I'll ever be," Matthew replied, securing the last strap on his saddle. He turned to face her, drinking in the sight of her as if to memorize every detail, her chestnut hair glowing in the morning light, the determined set of her jaw, the slight vulnerability in her eyes that she tried so hard to hide. "I packed some food for the journey," she said, offering the package. "Biscuits and jerky, should last a couple of days." Matthew took it, his fingers brushing hers in the exchange. "Thank you." An awkward silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken words and uncertain futures. After a moment, Lillian cleared her throat. "The Double Diamond is expecting you. You should get going if you want to make good distance before nightfall." "Lillian," Matthew began, stepping closer. "I meant what I said, when the drive is over." "I know what you said," she interrupted gently. "And I'm not asking you to repeat those promises, just be safe on the trail, that's all I ask." He studied her face, recognizing the armor she was reassembling piece by piece, preparing herself for his absence, for the possibility that he might not return despite his intentions. "I've never been one for grand gestures or flowery words," he said quietly, "but I need you to understand something before I go." She met his gaze, wariness and hope warring in her expression. "What's that?" "For years I've moved from place to place, never feeling tied to anywhere or anyone. I told myself it was freedom, but I realize now it was just emptiness dressed up as independence." He reached out, tentatively touching her cheek with calloused fingers. When she didn't pull away, he continued. "Then I woke up in your home, with a bullet hole in my shoulder and you scowling down at me like I was the most inconvenient thing that had ever happened to you." A reluctant smile touched her lips at the memory. And somehow, Matthew continued, in these weeks of healing and working alongside you, I've found something I never knew I was missing. Not just a place that feels like home, but a person who feels like the other half of a conversation I've been having with myself all my life. Lillian's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she remained silent, letting him finish. So yes, I'm riding away today. I gave my word and I won't break it. But Lillian Grayson, make no mistake, I am coming back. Not because I owe you or because I have nowhere else to go, but because the thought of building a life with you makes every other path seem hollow by comparison. A single tear escaped, tracing its way down her cheek. Matthew gently brushed it away with his thumb. You don't have to say anything, he assured her. Just know that while I'm gone, every mile of trail, every day of that cattle drive, I'll be thinking of this place. Of you. Lillian swallowed hard, visibly struggling with her composure. Then, to his surprise, she reached up and touched the simple silver ring she wore on a chain around her neck, her mother's wedding band, she'd once told him. My father used to say that words were just air unless backed by deeds, she said softly. So I won't make speeches or promises I don't know if I can keep. Her fingers closed around the ring momentarily before she looked up at him with newfound resolve. But I will be here, Matt. I will tend this land, and I will hope. It was perhaps the most meaningful declaration she could have made, an admission that despite her fears and past losses, she was willing to leave the door open to possibility. To him. Overcome by emotion, Matthew did the only thing that felt right in that moment. He leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in a gentle, questioning kiss. For a heartbeat, she remained still, and he feared he'd overstepped. Then her hand came up to rest against his chest, not pushing him away but anchoring herself as she tentatively returned the kiss. It was brief, a promise rather than a passion, but when they parted, something fundamental had shifted between them. The uncertainty remained, but beneath it lay a foundation stronger than either had dared to hope for. I should go, Matthew said reluctantly, his voice rough with emotion. Lillian nodded, taking a step back. Yes, you should. He mounted his horse, looking down at her one last time. The wheat will need tending while I'm gone. Don't try to do it all yourself. A watery laugh escaped her. Are you giving me instructions about my own farm, Matthew Jameson? Just reminding you that you don't have to carry everything alone anymore, he replied with a gentle smile. Even when I'm not physically here. She crossed her arms, a hint of her usual stubborn expression returning. I've managed this long. I know you have, that's part of why I love you. The words slipped out naturally, without premeditation. For a moment both looked startled at the declaration, then Matthew straightened in the saddle, owning the truth he'd spoken. I do, you know, love you. Lillian's arms tightened across her chest, as if physically holding herself together. Go, she whispered, go before I ask you to stay. Understanding that she needed this, needed him to prove through action rather than words that his feelings would endure separation, Matthew nodded. He turned his horse toward the trail that would take him back to the Double Diamond, back to the life he'd known before a bullet and fate had brought him to Lillian Grayson's door. Summer's end, he called back. I'll return by summer's end. Watch for me. He didn't wait for her response, knowing that to look back now might weaken his resolve to fulfill his obligations before claiming the future he truly wanted. Instead, he urged his horse forward, leaving behind the woman who had saved more than just his life. She had saved the part of him that still believed in belonging somewhere to someone. As the distance grew between them, Matthew made a silent vow that transcended the promise he'd spoken aloud. He would return, yes. But more than that, he would spend every day thereafter proving to Lillian that some people did stay, that some loves were strong enough to weather separation and doubt, and that the life they could build together would be worth every moment of uncertainty they'd endured to find it. Behind him, standing alone before the cabin they had shared, Lillian watched until horse and rider disappeared beyond the ridge. Only then did she allow herself to whisper the words she hadn't been brave enough to say to his face. I'll be waiting. July brought relentless heat to the Montana territory, baking the earth and testing the endurance of both crops and those who tended them. For Lillian, the days fell into a familiar pattern of solitary work, irrigating the newly planted field, tending the vegetable garden, repairing what needed fixing around the homestead. Yet despite the outward similarity to the life she'd led before Matthew's arrival, everything felt irrevocably changed. She found herself listening for a second set of footsteps that weren't there, turning to share observations with a person who had ridden away, leaving spaces in her daily existence that she hadn't known could feel so empty. Even the cabin itself seemed to echo with absence, as if the walls themselves missed his presence. "This is precisely what you feared," she chided herself one evening as she sat alone on the porch, watching thunderclouds gather over the distant mountains. Becoming accustomed to someone else, only to feel their absence like a wound. Yet try as she might to resurrect the walls of self-sufficiency that had protected her for so long, Lillian found them crumbling faster than she could rebuild them. Matthew Jameson had done more than simply heal under her roof and help with her farm. He had reminded her what it felt like to care deeply for another person, to imagine a future that included more than solitary perseverance. The realization was as frightening as it was exhilarating. As July gave way to August, Lillian's anticipation began to war with anxiety. The cattle drive would be nearing its completion if all had gone according to plan. Each day might bring Matthew's return or confirmation that, like others before him, his promises had been swept away by distance and circumstance. She tried to temper her hope with practicality. Even if he truly intended to return, 1,000 things could delay or prevent him: injury, extended work obligations, impassable trails. The frontier was notorious for disrupting the best-laid plans. Yet despite her efforts at caution, Lillian found herself scanning the horizon more frequently, listening for hoofbeats that weren't stampeding cattle or wild horses, imagining how she might react when, if he appeared on the trail leading to her homestead. Would she run to meet him, abandoning dignity in favor of honest joy? Would she wait on the porch, maintaining the appearance of composure while her heart raced beneath her calm exterior? The uncertainty of her own reactions troubled her almost as much as the uncertainty of his return. It was during this period of anticipation that an unexpected visitor arrived at the homestead, Sheriff Thomas Blackwell from Bitter Creek, a man Lillian had met only twice before when accompanying her father to town years earlier. She was weeding the garden when the sound of approaching hooves drew her attention to the trail. Rising quickly, she wiped her hands on her apron and moved toward the house where her rifle leaned against the porch railing, a precaution born of years of frontier life. The rider came into view, his badge catching the afternoon sunlight as he approached. Lillian relaxed slightly but didn't abandon her position near the weapon. "Miss Grayson," the sheriff called as he reined his horse to a stop. "Apologize for riding in unannounced." "Sheriff Blackwell," she acknowledged with a cautious nod. "What brings you all the way out here? Is there trouble?" The older man dismounted, removing his hat respectfully. "Not exactly trouble, ma'am. More a matter of information that might concern you." He glanced around the homestead, his expression unreadable. "I understand you've been harboring a man named Matthew Jameson these past months." Lillian's heart skipped painfully. "He was injured. I tended to his wounds. He left some weeks ago to return to his employment at the Double Diamond Ranch." She kept her voice neutral despite the sudden dread pooling in her stomach. "Has something happened?" Sheriff Blackwell sighed, turning his hat in his hands. "Miss Grayson, I'm not sure how to tell you this, but it seems Mr. Jameson may not have been entirely forthcoming about his circumstances." "What do you mean?" Lillian asked, her fingers tightening on her apron. "A wanted circular arrived from Wyoming Territory last month. Seems a man matching Jameson's description is wanted for questioning in connection with a stagecoach robbery near Cheyenne. 2 men dead, including the driver." The world seemed to tilt beneath Lillian's feet. There must be some mistake. Matthew is a cowhand at the Double Diamond. He was shot while riding through Curtis Pass. The sheriff's expression softened with something like pity. "I sent an inquiry to the Double Diamond, Miss Grayson. They have no record of employing a Matthew Jameson in recent years." Lillian felt as if all the air had been forced from her lungs. She gripped the porch railing to steady herself, unwilling to show weakness before the sheriff but unable to completely hide her shock. "I'm not saying he's guilty of anything," Sheriff Blackwell continued, clearly uncomfortable with her distress. "The circular only says wanted for questioning. Could be a case of mistaken identity. But I thought you should know, given that he spent time here and, well, given that your father is gone and you're out here alone." "I appreciate your concern," Lillian managed, her voice sounding distant to her own ears. but I assure you I'm quite capable of looking after myself." The sheriff nodded. "Never doubted that, Miss Grayson. Your father raised a capable woman." He replaced his hat, preparing to depart. "If Jameson returns, I'd appreciate it if you'd send word to me in Bitter Creek. Not to cause trouble, you understand, just to clear things up." "Of course," Lillian replied automatically, her mind still reeling from the implications of what she'd heard. After the sheriff had ridden away, Lillian remained standing on the porch, staring at the horizon as if it might offer answers to the questions now thundering through her mind. Had everything been a lie? The cattle drive, his employment at the Double Diamond, his promises to return, were they all fabrications designed to gain her trust? And the bullet wound, had it truly been from an anonymous shooter in Curtis Pass or from a lawman's gun during a stagecoach robbery? The wheat field they had cleared together caught her eye, the young plants swaying in the afternoon breeze, tangible evidence of their shared labor, of what she had believed was a foundation for something true. Now even that seemed tainted by doubt. That night, as a summer storm battered the homestead, Lillian sat by the fire with her father's Bible open on her lap, seeking comfort in its familiar pages but finding her thoughts too turbulent for prayer or reflection. Outside, thunder crashed and lightning illuminated the landscape in brief, harsh flashes that matched the jagged pain in her chest. "Fool," she whispered to herself, a tear slipping down her cheek despite her resolve not to weep over a man who had possibly deceived her from the start. "You knew better than to trust so easily." Yet even as she castigated herself for her naivete, memories of Matthew rose unbidden, his patience as he taught her to mend the chicken coop properly, his genuine appreciation for her cooking, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the gentle pressure of his lips against hers in that farewell kiss. Could all of that have been merely the performance of a skilled deceiver? Something deep within her rebelled against the thought. The Matthew she had come to know, to love, though she had never said the words aloud, had shown a consistency of character that seemed at odds with the portrait the sheriff had painted. "There must be an explanation," she murmured, closing the Bible and setting it aside. "There must be." But as lightning split the sky once more and rain lashed against the windows of the cabin they had shared, Lillian faced the bitter possibility that the explanation might be the simplest one. That Matthew Jameson, like so many who passed through the frontier territories, was not what he appeared to be, and that the future she had cautiously begun to imagine had been built on nothing more substantial than morning mist. 2 weeks after the sheriff's visit, Lillian spotted a rider approaching from the north, the direction of the Double Diamond Ranch. Her heart leaped traitorously in her chest before caution reasserted itself. Standing on the porch with her father's rifle held casually but ready at her side, she waited as the figure drew nearer. Even at a distance, she recognized the set of his shoulders, the way he sat the saddle. Matthew. He rode slowly as if giving her time to prepare for his arrival, or perhaps preparing himself. As he came within clear view, Lillian could see changes in him from their months apart. His face was more weathered, his frame slightly leaner, but his eyes, when they found hers, held the same clear intensity she remembered. He reined his horse to a stop at a respectful distance, seeming to sense her wariness. For a long moment they simply regarded each other in silence, the summer wind rustling the wheat field between them like whispered secrets. "You came back," Lillian finally said, her voice carefully neutral despite the storm of emotions beneath. Matthew nodded, removing his hat. "I promised I would." "Did you?" she asked, her grip tightening on the rifle. "Promise, I mean, or was that just another story like your employment at the Double Diamond?" His expression shifted from hopeful to wary in an instant. "You know, Sheriff Blackwell paid me a visit," Lillian confirmed, watching his reaction closely. "He says you're wanted for questioning about a stagecoach robbery, that 2 men died. That the Double Diamond has no record of you." Matthew closed his eyes briefly, pain etching itself across his features. When he opened them again, the directness of his gaze was unchanged. "May I get down from this horse and explain? I'll understand if you'd rather I kept my distance, but this isn't a conversation I want to have shouting across your yard." Lillian considered him, weighing the risk against the need for answers. Finally she nodded, though she didn't lower the rifle. "You can come up to the porch, no closer unless I say otherwise." He dismounted slowly, tethering his horse to the hitching post before approaching with deliberate, open-handed movements that acknowledged her caution. When he reached the bottom of the porch steps, he stopped, respecting her boundary. I wasn't entirely honest about my circumstances, he admitted without preamble. But I never lied about who I am or what I feel for you. Start with the double diamond, Lillian directed, her voice steadier than her heart. Were you ever employed there? Matthew nodded, yes, but not recently. I worked there from when I was 19 until about a year ago. I left after a dispute with the new foreman, a man who thought breaking horses meant breaking their spirit rather than earning their trust. And the stagecoach robbery. The dead men. Pain flashed across his face. I was there, but not as a robber. He took a deep breath. My friend Owen Barnes and I were riding back from Cheyenne when we came upon the stagecoach. It had already been attacked, the driver shot, the guard wounded. The passengers were huddled inside while 3 men were going through their belongings. He paused, the memory clearly distressing him. Owen and I tried to intervene. There was gunfire. Owen was killed instantly. I got a bullet in the leg but managed to drive the robbers off before they could harm the passengers. Lillian frowned, confusion momentarily outweighing suspicion. But the sheriff said you were wanted for questioning about the robbery itself. The guard died of his wounds before he could identify the real robbers, Matthew explained grimly. A passenger panicked and told the local law that Owen and I had been part of the gang, that we'd had a falling out over the spoils. By the time I'd gotten Owen's body back to his family and my leg had healed enough to return and clear my name, the story had solidified. No one was interested in my version of events. So you've been running from the law, Lillian concluded, trying to reconcile this revelation with the man she thought she knew. Matthew shook his head. Not running, exactly. Avoiding trouble while I figured out how to prove my innocence. When I was shot near your property, I was on my way to Fort Benton. There's a federal marshal there who worked with my father years ago. I was hoping he might help me clear my name. He gestured to his shoulder. That bullet wasn't from a random attack. The real stagecoach robbers have been tracking me, worried I might identify them, I suppose. They caught up to me in Curtis Pass. Lillian absorbed this, her mind working to separate truth from possible deception. Why didn't you tell me any of this when you were staying here? You let me believe you were just a cowhand heading back to his ranch. At first I was barely conscious, Matthew reminded her. Later, he sighed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration she recognized. Later I was afraid, not of you turning me in, but of bringing danger to your door. Those men were still out there. Then, as we grew closer, I feared losing your trust, your good opinion. His expression turned rueful. I convinced myself I'd tell you everything once I'd cleared my name, that it would be better for you not to be burdened with my troubles. That wasn't your decision to make, Lillian said sharply. I took you in, tended your wounds, shared my home with you. I deserved the truth. You're right, Matthew agreed without hesitation. It was wrong of me to keep this from you. I can only say that by the time I realized how much you had come to mean to me, I was terrified of losing you. He met her gaze steadily. It was cowardice, plain and simple, and I've regretted it every day since I rode away. Lillian studied him, searching for any hint of insincerity in his words or manner. She found none, only the same forthright quality that had drawn her to him from the beginning, despite her best efforts to maintain distance. Where have you been these past months? She asked finally. Not on a cattle drive, I presume. Fort Benton, mostly, he replied. The Marshal Joshua Harrison agreed to help investigate my case. We've been gathering evidence, tracking down the passengers from the stagecoach, building a case against the real robbers. Hope flickered unwillingly in Lillian's chest. And did you clear your name? A small smile touched Matthew's lips. Yes, 3 days ago they arrested the actual perpetrators, brothers named Thorne. One of them confessed, hoping for leniency. Marshal Harrison sent telegrams to all the jurisdictions where wanted circulars had been posted. By now, Sheriff Blackwell should have received notification that I've been exonerated. Lillian slowly lowered the rifle, though she didn't set it aside completely. That's good news. It is, Matthew agreed quietly. But it's not why I came back, Lillian. I would have returned regardless, to tell you the truth, to face whatever judgment you deemed appropriate. I made a promise to you, and this time I intended to keep it without secrets between us. The sincerity in his voice tugged at something deep within her, but the wound of his deception remained raw. How can I trust anything you say now? How do I know this isn't just another story designed to win my sympathy? You can ride to Bitter Creek and confirm everything with Sheriff Blackwell, Matthew offered. Or I can take you to Fort Benton to speak with Marshal Harrison yourself. I'll do whatever it takes to prove I'm being honest with you now. He paused, his expression vulnerable in a way that made her heart ache despite her anger. But I hope you might find it in yourself to believe me without those measures. Not because I deserve your trust, I don't, not yet, but because I think you know in your heart who I truly am. Lillian closed her eyes briefly, overwhelmed by the conflicting emotions battling within her. When she opened them again, her decision was made. Wait here, she instructed, turning to enter the cabin. Inside, she moved to the small wooden box on the mantel where she kept her most precious possessions, her mother's locket, her father's pocket watch, the deed to the homestead. From it, she withdrew a folded piece of paper that had arrived just yesterday, carried by a passing trader who occasionally brought mail from Bitter Creek. Returning to the porch, she extended the paper toward Matthew. This came for me. You should read it. Confusion furrowed his brow as he accepted the document, unfolding it carefully. As his eyes scanned the contents, understanding dawned on his face. This is from Sheriff Blackwell, he said, looking up at her. Confirming that the charges against me have been dropped. Lillian nodded. It arrived yesterday. He apologized for any distress his previous visit might have caused. Hope brightened Matthew's eyes. You already knew I'd been cleared. I knew the charges were dropped, Lillian corrected. I didn't know your version of events or why you had lied to me all those months. And now that you do, he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Can you forgive me, Lillian? Can we find our way back to what was growing between us before I left? Lillian descended the porch steps slowly until she stood directly before him, close enough to see the flecks of deeper blue in his eyes, to detect the slight tremor in his hands as he awaited her verdict. You hurt me, she said simply, not just with the deception, but with the lack of faith it represented. You didn't trust me enough to decide for myself whether to stand by you through your troubles. I know, he acknowledged, remorse evident in every line of his face. And if I could go back and change that decision, I would, but I can't. I can only promise to never make the same mistake again, to be honest with you in all things, whatever the consequences. Lillian drew a steadying breath. When you rode away, I told myself not to hope for your return. That hoping would only make the disappointment worse when you didn't come back, but I hoped anyway. She met his gaze directly. I don't want to live that way anymore, Matt, always bracing for loss, always keeping parts of myself hidden to minimize the pain when people leave. What are you saying? Matthew asked, confusion and tentative hope warring in his expression. I'm saying that trust isn't just about believing someone's words, she replied. It's about having the courage to be vulnerable, to risk pain for the possibility of something better. You weren't the only one who was afraid. I've been keeping people at arm's length since my father died, telling myself it was strength when really, it was just another kind of cowardice. She reached out, hesitantly touching his cheek with her fingertips. I don't want to be afraid anymore. Matthew covered her hand with his own, turning his face slightly to press a kiss to her palm. Does this mean you're giving us another chance? It means, Lillian said slowly, that I believe your explanation, and I understand why you kept the truth from me, even if I don't condone it. It means I'm willing to try again, with honesty between us this time. She withdrew her hand gently but remained close. But trust takes time to rebuild, Matt. It won't happen overnight. I understand, he assured her, and I'll earn back every bit of trust I lost, however long it takes. His expression turned serious. There's something else you should know, something I discovered during my time away. Lillian tensed slightly. More secrets? No, nothing like that, Matthew assured her quickly. It's about my future plans. The marshal offered me a position as a deputy in Fort Benton. Steady work, respectable pay. Oh, Lillian said, trying to hide her disappointment. Fort Benton was nearly a week's ride away, too far for anything but occasional visits. That's a good opportunity. It is, Matthew agreed, but I turned it down. Surprise flickered across her features. Why would you do that? After everything you've been through, a position with the law would secure your reputation. Because it would take me away from here, he answered simply. Away from you, and if these months apart have taught me anything, it's that no opportunity is worth that price. Hope unfurled in Lillian's chest, tentative but undeniable. What will you do instead? Matthew smiled, the gesture transforming his face with a warmth that reminded her of all the reasons she'd come to care for him. Well, there's this homestead I know. Beautiful piece of land with good water and rich soil. The north field was recently cleared and planted with wheat that's coming along nicely. His eyes held her steadily. The woman who owns it is the most remarkable person I've ever known, stubborn, brave, and far too independent for her own good sometimes. I thought perhaps she might need a partner, someone to share the work and the rewards. Someone who sees the value in what she's built and wants to help it grow. Lillian felt her breath catch. A business arrangement. Not exactly, Matthew replied, taking her hand in his. More of a life arrangement. If she'll have me. The implication hung in the air between them, both thrilling and terrifying in its clarity. Lillian found herself at a crossroads, the familiar path of self-reliance stretching in one direction and the unknown territory of shared futures in the other. Are you asking what I think you're asking? She managed finally. Because if you are, you should know that I don't make such decisions lightly, especially not after. After I broke your trust, he finished for her. I understand that, Lillian. And no, I'm not proposing marriage, not today. What I'm proposing is a chance to rebuild what we started before I left, to work side by side, to face whatever comes together, and to see if what I believe in my heart, that we belong together, proves true in the living of it. Relief and something like disappointment mingled in Lillian's chest. That seemed sensible. Matthew's lips quirked in a half-smile. Sensible wasn't quite what I was aiming for, but I'll take it as a start. Despite herself, Lillian found an answering smile tugging at her lips. You always did have a way of making me reconsider my careful plans. Is that a yes? He asked, hope evident in his voice. Will you let me stay, Lillian? Let me prove through actions, rather than words, that what I feel for you is real and lasting. Lillian looked past him to the homestead they had tended together, to the wheat field they had cleared side by side, to the repaired chicken coop that still kept the foxes at bay, to the cabin that had felt so empty in his absence. Then she looked back to the man before her, with his honest blue eyes and the courage to return and face her judgment despite the risk of rejection. Yes, she said finally, the word carrying the weight of all she'd been afraid to hope for. But on one condition. Name it, Matthew replied instantly. No more secrets between us, Lillian said firmly, not ever again. I need to know that whatever challenges come, we'll face them together, openly and honestly. Matthew nodded solemnly. You have my word, no more secrets. He hesitated, then added with the ghost of a smile, though I should warn you, I've been planning a surprise for your birthday next month. Does that count as a forbidden secret? Lillian laughed then, the sound releasing some of the tension that had held her rigid since his arrival. I suppose I can allow that particular kind of secret. As the summer sun warmed the land around them and the wheat they had planted together swayed in the gentle breeze, Lillian Grayson took another step away from the solitude that had defined her life for so long. It wasn't a declaration of undying love or a dramatic reconciliation. It was something quieter, more cautious, but perhaps more meaningful for its deliberate nature. It was a choice to believe that sometimes, against all odds and past experience, people did come back, that some wounds could heal stronger than before, that love, like the tenacious wheat stretching toward the Montana sky, could take root even in soil that had known hardship. And as Matthew's hand closed gently around hers, Lillian allowed herself to believe that perhaps this time, hope would not lead to disappointment, but to something she had stopped believing was possible on the unforgiving frontier. A future shared rather than faced alone. Autumn painted the Montana landscape in russets and golds, the turning season bringing with it a harvest more bountiful than Lillian had dared to anticipate. The Northfield had yielded well despite being newly cleared, and together, she and Matthew had gathered and stored enough wheat to see them through winter with some to spare for spring trading. The month since his return had been a careful dance of rebuilding trust, of learning to share not just work but dreams and fears as well. True to his word, Matthew had kept no further secrets. He told her everything about his time in Fort Benton, about the investigation that had cleared his name, about his hopes for their future together. In turn, Lillian had gradually lowered the walls she'd built around her heart, allowing herself to acknowledge what she'd known deep down since before he'd left, that Matthew Jameson had become essential to her happiness in a way she'd never believed possible. They had settled into partnership with surprising ease, their strengths complementing each other's weaknesses. Matthew's skill with horses and livestock balanced Lillian's knowledge of crops and preservation. His easygoing nature softened her tendency towards stern practicality, while her attention to detail kept his occasional impulsiveness in check. By unspoken agreement, Matthew had taken up residence in the small cabin that had once been used for storage, giving Lillian her space in the main house. It was a compromise that honored propriety while allowing them to build something meaningful between them, something neither was willing to rush after the misunderstandings that had nearly kept them apart. On a crisp October evening, as the first hints of winter's approach whispered in the cooling air, they sat together on the porch steps, watching the sunset paint the mountains in fading light. A comfortable silence had settled between them, the kind that comes only with true understanding. "First snow will be coming soon," Matthew observed, his breath forming small clouds in the chilly air. "Earlier than last year, I'd wager." Lillian nodded, drawing her shawl closer around her shoulders. "The geese flew south earlier this year, and the squirrels have been gathering more than usual." She glanced at him, a smile touching her lips. "My father always said nature knows more about weather than any almanac." "Wise man your father," Matthew replied, his eyes warm as they rested on her face. "I wish I could have known him." "He would have liked you," Lillian said softly, surprising herself with the certainty of it. "Once he got past his suspicions, that is, he was protective." "As he should have been," Matthew agreed. "He raised an extraordinary daughter." Color rose in Lillian's cheeks, still unaccustomed to such direct compliments despite the months they'd spent together. "The wheat field was a success," she said, changing the subject to more practical matters. "I was thinking we might clear the eastern section next spring, expand further." Matthew's smile deepened. "We," he repeated. "I like the sound of that." "Well, I certainly can't do it alone," Lillian replied practically, though her eyes held a warmth that belied her matter-of-fact tone. "No one should have to do everything alone," Matthew said, his voice growing more serious. "Even the things they could manage if pressed." Lillian studied him, noting the slight tension that had entered his posture. "What's on your mind, Matt? You've been preoccupied since supper." He chuckled, shaking his head. "I should know better than to think I could hide anything from you, even something as simple as nervousness." "Nervousness?" Lillian echoed, frowning slightly. "What do you have to be nervous about?" Matthew shifted to face her more directly, taking her hand in his. "Lillian, these past months have been the happiest of my life, working beside you, building something meaningful together. It's everything I hoped for and more." Her heart began to beat faster at the earnestness in his expression. "I've been happy too," she admitted quietly. "When I came back," he continued, "I told you I wasn't proposing marriage, that we needed time to rebuild what my deception had damaged. I meant that. I wanted to prove through actions rather than words that you could trust me again, that what we have is real and lasting." Lillian nodded, unable to find her voice as she realized where this conversation was heading. "I believe I've kept that promise," Matthew said. "I've been honest in all things, worked alongside you without complaint, respected your boundaries even when it wasn't easy." A smile touched his lips. "And if the way you've started looking at me when you think I don't notice is any indication, I think perhaps you might be ready to consider a more permanent arrangement." "Matthew Jameson," Lillian managed, her voice barely above a whisper, "are you proposing to me while I'm wearing a dirty apron and work boots?" He laughed, the sound carrying on the evening air. "I am indeed, because I don't love some dressed-up, Sunday-best version of you, Lillian Grayson. I love the woman who works this land with calloused hands and unfailing determination. The woman who nursed a wounded stranger back to health despite her better judgment. The woman who had the courage to give me a second chance when I'd given her every reason to turn me away." Reaching into his pocket, Matthew withdrew a small object that caught the last rays of sunlight, a ring, simple but beautiful, with a small pearl set in silver. "I've been carrying this for weeks, waiting for the right moment," he confessed. but I realized today, watching you bring in the last of the harvest, that there is no perfect moment except the one we create by choosing each other." Lillian stared at the ring, her vision blurring with unexpected tears. "Where did you get this?" "Bitter Creek," he replied. "Remember that supply run last month? I made a stop at the jeweler's." His expression grew worried as he noted her tears. "Is it not to your liking?" "I chose a pearl because diamonds seem too flashy for a woman who appreciates honest beauty over ostentation. But—" "It's perfect," Lillian interrupted, reaching out to touch the ring with trembling fingers. "It's just, I never thought I'd have this. After my father died, I convinced myself that solitude was safer than hoping for anything more." Matthew's expression softened with understanding. "And now, she said, meeting his gaze directly, "I find that some risks are worth taking, that some people do keep their promises, that a life shared is infinitely richer than one faced alone." Hope brightened his eyes. "Is that a yes?" Instead of answering immediately, Lillian reached beneath the collar of her dress and withdrew the chain that held her mother's wedding band, the ring she'd worn since her father's death as a reminder of what love had once existed in their family. "My father gave this to my mother when they had nothing but dreams and each other," she said softly, unclasping the chain. She slid the ring off and held it out to Matthew. "If we're to build a life together, I want you to have something of my past to carry into our future." Matthew stared at the offered ring, clearly understanding the significance of the gesture. "Lillian, that's your most treasured possession. I couldn't—" "You can," she insisted gently, "and you will. A partnership goes both ways, Matthew. You've offered me a future, I'm offering you a connection to my past. Both are precious." With visible emotion, Matthew accepted the simple gold band. Then, with hands that trembled slightly, he took her left hand and slid the pearl ring onto her finger. "Lillian Grayson, will you marry me? Will you build a life with me on this land that you've tended so faithfully? Will you face whatever comes, good harvests and lean ones, joyful days and difficult ones, as my wife, my partner, my heart's true home?" Lillian looked down at the pearl gleaming softly on her finger, then back to the man who had ridden into her life wounded and desperate, and had returned to it by choice and devotion. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and certain despite the tears that spilled onto her cheeks. "Yes to all of it." Matthew's face transformed with joy, and he drew her into his arms with a gentleness that belied his strength. When his lips met hers, Lillian felt the last of her reservations dissolve like morning frost beneath the sun. This was right, this was true. This was the beginning of something neither of them had dared to hope for before fate and a bullet had brought them together. As twilight deepened around the homestead, they would now share as husband and wife. Lillian Grayson, soon to be Lillian Jameson, realized that the very isolation she had once considered her protection had actually been a prison of her own making. It had taken a wounded cowboy with honest blue eyes and unwavering determination to show her that vulnerability wasn't weakness, but courage of the most profound kind. And as she rested her head against Matthew's shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek, Lillian understood that in nursing his body back to health all those months ago, she had unwittingly allowed him to heal something far more precious. Her belief in the possibility of love that lasted, of promises kept despite all odds, of a future brighter than the past that had shaped her. It was a miracle as quiet and profound as the Montana sunset spreading its final golden light across the land they would tend together for all the days to come. The wedding was held on the first Sunday of November, a clear, crisp day that seemed crafted specifically for the occasion. The small church in Bitter Creek overflowed with well-wishers, neighboring homesteaders, townspeople who remembered Lillian's father, ranch hands from nearby properties, and even Marshall Harrison, who had traveled from Fort Benton to stand as Matthew's best man. Lillian wore her mother's dress, carefully altered and adorned with fresh ribbon. As she walked down the short aisle on Sheriff Blackwell's arm, the older man having offered to stand in for her father when he learned of the engagement, her eyes remained fixed on Matthew, who waited at the altar with an expression of such profound joy that it brought whispered sighs from even the most stoic attendees. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, their vows exchanged in clear voices that carried to every corner of the small church. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Matthew kissed his bride with tender reverence, applause erupted spontaneously, celebrating not just a union of two people, but the kind of frontier love story that gave hope to all who witnessed it. The celebration continued at the homestead, where tables had been set up in the yard and food prepared by neighboring women filled every available surface. Fiddle music lifted into the afternoon air as couples danced on the packed earth, laughter and conversation flowing as freely as the cider and coffee being served. As twilight approached, Marshall Harrison raised his cup in a toast that hushed the gathering. "To Matthew and Lillian Jameson," he announced, his deep voice carrying across the yard. "May your union be as strong as the mountains that watch over you, as nourishing as the land you tend together, and as enduring as the frontier spirit that brought you both to this moment. In a territory where hardship is plentiful and blessings sometimes scarce, you have found in each other the greatest treasure any person could hope for, a love worth fighting for, worth returning to, worth building a life upon." "Hear, hear," came the response from the gathered guests, cups and glasses raised in affirmation. Later, as the celebration continued around them, Matthew drew Lillian away from the crowd to the quiet of the porch steps where he had proposed just weeks earlier. "Happy Mrs. Jameson?" he asked softly, his arm encircling her waist. Lillian leaned into his embrace, watching their friends and neighbors enjoying the festivities. "More than I ever believed possible," she admitted, "though I'm still getting used to the new name." "It suits you," Matthew murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Almost as much as this place suits us both." Lillian nodded, her gaze taking in the homestead that had once felt like her burden to bear alone and now represented their shared future. The cabin had been expanded with Matthew's skilled carpentry, a new room added in preparation for their marriage. The barn stood repaired and ready for the additional livestock they planned to acquire in the spring. The wheat from their first harvest together was safely stored, promising sustenance through the winter months ahead. "I never thought I'd share this place with anyone," she confessed. "After my father died, I was so determined to prove I could manage alone that I never considered how much more might be possible with the right partner." Matthew's arm tightened around her. "And I never thought I'd find a place that called to me to stay rather than move on. We've both had our assumptions challenged, it seems." "For the better," Lillian added, turning to look up at him. In the gathering dusk, his features were softened, but his eyes held the same clear certainty that had drawn her to him from the beginning. "Do you remember that day you first woke up in my house?" she asked. "You called me an angel." Matthew laughed softly. "I was delirious with fever, but not entirely wrong." "Hardly an angel," Lillian corrected, smiling at the memory. "I was prickly and suspicious and determined to keep you at arm's length." "And yet you saved my life anyway," Matthew pointed out. "That seems rather angelic from where I'm standing." Lillian shook her head, her expression growing more reflective. "I think perhaps we saved each other." The statement hung in the air between them, simple yet profound in its truth. Matthew had arrived at her homestead physically wounded. Lillian had been nursing wounds of a different kind, the loss of her family, the isolation of frontier life, the belief that vulnerability led only to pain. In healing each other, they had found something neither had been looking for but both desperately needed. "I love you, Lillian Jameson," Matthew said softly, the words still new enough to bring a flush to her cheeks. "And I promise you I always will." "I love you too," she replied, the declaration coming easier now than it had the first time she'd spoken it. "Enough to trust that promise, despite all the reasons experience gave me to doubt." As they sealed their exchange with a kiss, the first snowflakes of winter began to drift lazily from the darkening sky, not a storm but a gentle blessing, as if nature itself approved of their union. Around them, their guests noticed the snow and exclaimed in delight, many raising their faces to feel the cool touch of flakes on their skin. "First snow," Matthew murmured against her lips. "Right on time." Lillian smiled, thinking of the long winter ahead, not with dread as in years past, but with anticipation for quiet evenings by the fire, for the comfort of shared work and shared rest, for the chance to build dreams together while the world outside lay dormant beneath its white blanket. "Perfect timing," she agreed, drawing him closer as the snow continued to fall, transforming their homestead into something magical and new, just as love had transformed them both. And as their guests began to depart, calling final congratulations and well wishes as they hurried to reach their own homes before the snow grew heavier, Lillian and Matthew remained on the porch, watching as the familiar landscape of their shared life disappeared beneath winter's first embrace, not an ending, but a beautiful beginning. A wounded cowboy and a solitary woman, brought together by chance, bound now by choice and promise. Two souls who had found in each other not just healing for past hurts but hope for all the seasons yet to come. Together, they turned toward the warmth of their home, no longer her sanctuary or his temporary shelter, but theirs. Their haven, their future, their most precious harvest from seeds planted in the most unexpected of circumstances. And as the door closed behind them, shutting out the cold but not the beauty of the falling snow, Lillian knew with absolute certainty that some wounds, of body, of spirit, of heart, were meant to lead us not to scars but to healing more complete than we ever dared to imagine. A healing that came, sometimes, in the form of love found when and where we least expected it.